Hello, everyone, and congratulations for making it to the end of the day. My name is Sewagodimo Matlapeng, and I'm a software developer. I'm a junior dev, actually. I just got into it, / half marathon runner. This is the year I run a full marathon. Yeah. So my little sister used to do this really weird, not weird, like thing where at 9 o'clock every night on a school night, she would text me all the questions to her homework and then be like, "Hey, my curfew's at 9:30. Can you help me with this?" And at that point, there's not really much I can do to try to explain to her. I have to kind of give her the answers. And then one day I was like, "Okay, cool, girl. I see what you're doing, though." And she was like, "Yeah, well, the thing is, whenever we have homework, we discuss it in the WhatsApp group with all my classmates. And then when we can't find the answer, you're like the last resort because you're the only one of us with fast internet. And then we have to ask you. And then once I get the answers from you, I can share it with my classmates." And then I was like, "Yeah, but that's not, I mean, that's cute, but that's not fair on me." So the problem with her classmates is that they all have the same pool of resources and they all try to help each other, but it's very limited in the way that they get answers and they get help. And the other problem is that every year, a different group of students go through the same problem and they go through the same issue with resources and only being able to get help from people around you. And I thought to myself, well, if I had a question that I couldn't answer, what's the first thing you do as a developer? You just Google, and you most probably will find your answer in Stack Overflow. It's a reliable source of information for us. Shouldn't high school learners have the same thing? Shouldn't there be a hub where previous grade 11s can find all the questions for grade 11 maths or grade 11 science, and that makes it so much easier for them to get help? It also means that you can ask a question and get help from anyone in the country, which just makes stuff a whole lot easier. Another challenge the South African learners face is that most of the internet resources don't really follow our syllabus, and most conventions aren't very South African friendly. So my little sister once found a really good tutorial, but they were talking about inches most of the time. And she was like, I don't know how that works. So this really awesome tutorial becomes completely useless to me. And with also the language context, being able to ask a question in a language, being able to explain your problem in a language that makes the most sense to you, makes it a whole lot easier for you to get a response that's most useful to you. And then so her and I started working, I started working on Buza Answers, and it's just a Q&A site for high school kids. And this talk kind of covers some of the lessons I've learned along the way. I started this when I was still in university, and there's two versions of it. There's the Buza folder I don't look at anymore because it looks completely awful, and there's the one that's currently in user testing, which looks much neater. And in this talk, I'm just going to cover some of my lessons from that. So the current leads to the site looks like this. You should be able to get a question for a particular subject, and then you can get all the answers for that. And students should be able. We don't have a rating system yet because we're still deciding what the best rating system is, without trying to exclude or discourage students. Because a dislike can on Stack Overflow, maybe it's because we're all older and it's okay. But for high school learners who are trying to help each other, the idea of a dislike is a bit problematic. So we're still going over that. Yeah. So the first thing we had to think about when I was designing Buza with my little sister, and the first thing she mentioned is, most of the time we don't Google because we don't have data, and even if we do have data, I don't want to use my last 10 megabytes for my homework. Believe it or not, most South African students don't want to use the internet for learning because data is already expensive, and social networking is apparently more important. So 50% of South Africans only 50% of South Africans have access to the internet via smartphones. The rest of the country uses feature phones. And a huge part of that, the rest of the country, is students, because most likely as a child in the household, you're most likely to get the least expensive device. And so when we started designing Buza, we started thinking, who are we really targeting? And we're targeting people who may most likely use feature phones. And that means it's people who don't have JavaScript enabled on their phones, and they have smaller screens, and they don't also have access to fast internet. So we have to cater for that as we design it. So what we decided to go for a feature phone approach, and we decided to only use Django templates for the application. And what that means is that it can work on feature phones. And so we've currently have no JavaScript because our approach is to get it to use progressive enhancements. So if it can work on a feature phone just as well as it can work on a normal phone, and then what we do is we're currently just adding a bit of JavaScript into it to make it faster for people who are using smartphones, but users on feature phones will still have the same user experience. This also makes it eligible for Facebook Free Basics, and what that means is that through the Facebook Free Basics site, it can actually be 0 rated, so students can use the application for free. Because a huge part, the only thing that makes the application work is if users are actually on it, and the only way we can get students on it is if it's free, or else it's just not going to work. Yeah, so when I started working on this project, someone asked me, are you going to make this open source? And I was like, yeah, of course. How else am I going to get Travis? And that was all I was thinking about. And the other day, a friend of mine was like to me, there's different levels of open source. There's different ways in the approach to which we approach open source. Your initial reaction to the idea of open source is, great, it means I can get Travis for free and I can get all the GitHub benefits for open source projects. And it also means that it's easier for people to contribute to it, then I can get contributions. But then there's the level of open source where you start thinking, I want people to be able to reuse this project. I would like someone who has maybe an idea for a Q&A site for teachers to be able to plug and play this application and then kind of maybe set their own model and stuff, and then they can actually just recreate that. That's what's like, oh, and when someone suggested this to me, I was like, this is such a good idea, but it adds complexity that I'm not emotionally ready for. Yeah, so now this talk is just going to cover whether you should be writing code, how to choose a framework, setting up your environment, following test-driven development, and all the way down to deploying your application. Yeah, tech savior syndrome. So I think tech savior syndrome is basically the idea that as people who are tech enthusiasts, as developers, and people in the tech field, we want technology to be the solution for everything. We want to build an application for everything. A friend of mine who works for OpenUp SA was a part of a government project where they decided that lines were too long in clinics and people were often lining up at 3 a.m. to get to the clinic line just to be able to get there. And the clinic opens at like 8. So why are people lining up at 3? It's because the lines are so long. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to be able to build a digital system where you could go to the clinic and actually just input your name, just write your name, write your surname down, and they'll contact you when it's time for you, maybe an hour before, and then you can get to the clinic and you just go straight to the line because it's been automated. And they spent quite a lot of time designing this application. It's a government project, so they ran out of funds, and then they had to put in overtime, and it was really passionate and great. So they started user testing, and they get to the users, and they start talking to them about using this application, and then he's so passionate about it. And one of the people they were doing the experiments with is like, why don't we just write this down on a piece of paper? Like, I don't understand why I need to learn to use a tablet just so I can write my name down. Most of us don't know how to use tablets. And then he just stood there like, you know, if we had asked you what you wanted, this would have saved me a lot of sleepless nights. And he's like, we had to literally ditch the project and just use pen and paper. And this is a result of like how we often just over-engineer things. And I always say, if all the world's problems, specifically if Africa's problems could be solved using technology, that would be fantastic, because all of us right now would just code and just deploy a whole bunch of applications, and that would be it. We will solve poverty, housing issues, political issues, that would be great. However, Africa's problems sometimes are much simpler and much more complicated than just deploying an application and hoping that someone in the world uses it. Yeah, the next thing is about being your own enemy too, other than being an enemy to everyone else. And I think it's an egocentric thing that we have as developers, where you feel that if you're going to write your own application, if you're going to write your own system, it has to be yours from scratch. Everything that you use has to be yours, and you have to feel like you really own it and you've really developed it. And that's a horrible thing to do. If you own it, you have to be responsible for maintaining it. You have to be responsible for updates. When other people complain about something not working, you're the one who's responsible for fixing it. But if you're using someone else's technology, you're the person on the other end complaining, and then it becomes someone else's problem. And maybe you can make a few contributions here and there, but using someone else's system is going to make your life a whole lot easier. So when I started building Buza, I started thinking, it's a Q&A site, right? That's not revolutionary, that's not new. You've used Stack Overflow, and there's a Stack Exchange. So can't we just rebuild that and then kind of just create our own and call it South Africa's Stack Exchange? And the problem we had with that is Stack Exchange isn't necessarily built very well for translations, especially translations to African languages, and we were hoping to one day be able to do translations across the different languages. Another issue is that it's not exactly mobile phone friendly or teenager friendly. It's kind of designed for people who, you really need this more than we need you, so just get on with it. But for this application, we need our users. So we wanted to design something that high school students would love using and enjoy using, and would kind of feel like you're on Twitter, but you're getting help from other people and you're actually learning. And that's why we decided to build our own application from scratch. Yeah, so Buza 1.0, I designed it with a couple of my friends, and we kind of started it, and it was like rogue programming, and really we just wanted to be able to see stuff, we wanted to add stuff, and the code base was completely awful. And then eventually and then all my friends, like eventually one by one, everyone was like, oh, I can't help with this anymore. I'm moving to Joburg, I can't help. And then I was like by myself and trying to like navigate through everyone's code and trying to put everything together. And then I reached out to a friend of mine, Pi, and she's a senior developer. And I was like, hey, don't you want to look at this repo? And maybe you can like, look at my pull request for me. And then I was like, okay, cool. Is this still working? Okay, cool, awesome, thanks. And then she was like, okay, cool, I'll help you with this. I think it's a really good idea. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And then I make a pull request, and I sent her a pull request. She didn't really respond, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe, she's busy, she's a senior engineer. And then she's like, we should have like some time to discuss this project. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. She sat down with me, and she said, we're gonna have to just kind of scratch all the code out. And I was like, what? That's a weird thing to say. And she said, see, the problem is none of this is tested. You're using the really, really old way of developing applications. And I can't particularly read your code, but I see some things are going wrong in the UI, and I don't have the energy to like kind of figure out what's going on here. And she said to me, like, we should write production-ready code. And I was like, what's production-ready code? And it's like the type of code that develops an application that you can trust may not break in production. And if it does, you can pinpoint where things are going to go wrong. So the first thing I did wrong when I developed this application is every time I hung out with someone, I would tell them about it. This is the thing, like you start a new project, you get really excited, and I tell people, and I'm doing this, and my little sister thinks it's a really good idea, and then everyone would just have their own idea. I remember my first friend was like, you should add images, because like the writing literacy is a big issue for a lot of students. Adding images means that you can just draw something or write it down. If you have on a feature phone, sometimes typing out a long sentence, explaining what you're going through makes things difficult. And then I was like, you know what, you're right, we should add images. And then I added images, I got images working. I couldn't render them, but instead of focusing on the fact that they weren't rendering, I just pretended that that was okay. So I had a half-done feature, but you know what, I tried. And then someone else said, drawing is still hard. Like, I can't draw, but you know what I'd appreciate? Having voice notes. And then I was like, oh yeah, that would be really smart. Then people can like listen to your voice notes and understand what your problem is, and then maybe respond to you in a voice note or text. And then my friend was like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then I started thinking, how do you implement voice notes? Well, that's not important. What's important is I have this idea, so I have to add the feature. And I added a text field, and I said, to do, turn into a voice note later in the future. And so I had a whole bunch of all these features, and very few of them worked. And what that meant is things were just going wrong all over the place. They were just like bugs all over the place. And it's like, eventually, I just started not wanting to work on it because it felt like more things were broken than things that were actually there. And at the end, I kind of couldn't tell you, like if I was demoing the application to someone, like it's really painful when you have to be like, imagine this is a voice note feature. And then eventually I scrapped a whole bunch of stuff and I started early user testing. This was not actually early user testing. This is quite late user testing. And at this point, we had the question summary, the question description, and you could choose a subject, the topics, and then this form was longer than a page. It was completely awful. All you had to do was say, I don't know how to find the area of a triangle, and this was everything you had to go through. So a lot of students couldn't understand the concept of a summary. Like, it was not making sense to them. And to me, I was like, no, because you have a lengthy question, and then maybe you want to trim it down a little bit. And they were like, why would I want to trim it down? And the students were not actually asking really complicated questions. So on site, the first time you use the app, you ask something really simple, and I think that's just like getting introduced to it, getting ready to it. I'm not sure if you remember what your first Facebook post was, but it probably wasn't a long paragraph. And in my head, I think it's because in my head, I was thinking as someone who was trying to replicate Stack Overflow so much that I kept trying to make it the better version of Stack Overflow, as opposed to just assigning a site that students could post stuff in. And in the end, after having to fight with students about the idea of what topics was. So we had this thing, topics, where you could kind of create little tags, and it would be really cool, because then you could, let's say you only want to look at trigonometry stuff, you could just go to all the questions that are tagged with trigonometry, and to the students it didn't make sense. Even when I did very mildly suggest this is what they should add, it just was not reaching out. And that's when I really learned the importance of, like, think of the simplest thing and then make it simpler. My initial model had a whole bunch of things, but in the end, Pi said to me, when you describe your application, that's your entire data model. So Buza is a Q&A site where users can ask questions and get answers. The question is a body of text, the answer is a body of text, and you just have a user. That's all you're going to need. And it made sense, and then when we did the second user testing, students were asking questions that weren't even necessarily related to a particular subject. They were just using the app, but they did have this mentality that this was educational, that this would be regarding their education, and you had to ask a question, but it felt more intuitive. There were less hazards to go through. And that's when I just kind of started realizing that I really needed to oversimplify my thinking. Yeah, then after that, we had to restart the code base the right way instead of having a whole bunch of stuff that was just falling apart all over the place. So now I'm going to go over some of the technical lessons I learned about rebuilding Buza. Yeah, so when it comes to choosing a framework, if you're starting from the very beginning, it can be very difficult. I swear there's a new framework or a new language every 2 minutes, and it adds to the fatigue of just so many new things, and it makes it really complicated. And sometimes you get comparisons between infrastructures or between frameworks that literally that comparison doesn't make sense at all. When I started looking at Python web frameworks, everyone started comparing Flask and Django, and it didn't help me understand the difference between the two, other than the fact that one is a few milliseconds faster. And at the end, I was like, okay, but which one should I use? I still don't understand this matrix. It doesn't mean anything to me. And I realized that sometimes we compare the wrong things just because they're the trendiest. It's like when you hear people talking about, is Kubernetes replacing Docker? And then you find out what each one means, and you're like, you just wrote a whole article comparing things that make absolutely no sense to compare. And so I learned that Flask and CherryPy are microservice frameworks. So if you want to build something that's specifically or if you want to build a backend for your application, it's something that's maybe a bit more specialized in serving a particular single function, then you would probably go for something like that. But if you're rebuilding a full stack framework, you want your users, you want to have a database connection that doesn't put you through a lot of struggles, and you want to have a templating system that's already integrated into it. Basically, if you want to build a blogging site, you want to use something like Django because it comes with so many parts that work well into it. But if you're building a single backend maybe, and then your database backend, and then you just want something different for your front end, that's when you might consider something like Flask. And then I was like, if you had told me that, it could have saved me a lot of reading. So for the framework, I decided to go with Django. I think I was a bit, I didn't want to go with Django because I did want to go with the coolest thing, the latest thing, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to make me so cool when I tell people I'm working on this really cool tech. But what I later realized is how many times have I picked up a new piece of technology or something new, and in the end gave up because it was really badly documented. And not that it was just badly documented, but the people who write documentation oftentimes don't think about the million things that are definitely going to get wrong as you get started on this project. And so the nice thing about Django is that it's been around long enough to have a lot of things fixed. It's been around enough to have a lot of Stack Overflow questions and a lot of people who've gone through what you've been through, a lot of tutorials. It's really easy to find tutorials. And there's a lot of community support for Django stuff, for Django developers. And that makes it a whole lot easier, especially when you're working with something that's a side project or something you're doing in your alone time and you don't necessarily have a team of people who can kind of help you. So that's why one of the reasons I chose Django. Yeah, so setting up your Python environment. When I started this, I didn't really understand Python web development and how it works. And so at the beginning of every tutorial, you just kind of go through a series of things where people are like, just follow these instructions. You create a virtual environment, and then you have a package manager. And then sometimes your environment just doesn't work, and you don't know what's going on. And then when your environment doesn't work, the reasonable thing to do is just to delete your environment and start again. Eventually, this can get annoying, especially when you've removed your environment twice and then you realize, oh, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's actually my code that's making this fail. Okay, that's a possibility. And that's when, then I realized that your virtual environment is just having like a different site for things to run, and you can just install packages there, and it doesn't affect any other packages that are installed for different projects, and that kind of helps you manage multiple projects, which I'm now very grateful for. But there are issues with Python's package manager, which is pip. How many people in the room are Python developers? Ah, awesome. So there are some issues with you having a different virtual environment and having a package manager. So if you're a JavaScript developer, you probably have wherever your node modules are, that is sort of your virtual environment, because that's all the where all the dependencies for your project are stored. And then npm is the node package manager. So if you're using JavaScript, that would be what pip is. And however, there are some things that make it really difficult to work with a different virtual environment and a different package manager. And some of those is that you don't know which instructions are for which. You don't know what's broken when things aren't working. And the worst part is dealing with transitive dependencies. You don't really know what's installed because of what, and sometimes a dependency has two. For instance, PyTest and Django may have both use Markdown, but you'll find that one specifically requires, Markdown might be I don't work with, you find that PyTest doesn't work with Markdown 2, but Django requires everything above, all Markdown versions above 2, and that's when your pip and your virtual environment are I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to install the latest, this other package won't work, and that's up to you. Yeah, and then that's where you get pipenv. So pipenv is this cool Python thing where you have your virtual environment and your package manager as one thing, and because they work really well together, it's able to manage your environment quite easily. This is really amazing, unless you're a JavaScript developer, in which case you kind of already have this sorted out for you, but you're a Python developer, it's quite a problem. Another thing that's wrong with pip is that if you install an application, you actually have to go and write in the requirements file that I've installed this package, have this package, whereas if you're a JavaScript developer, you probably do know that your JSON log file updates that for you, and you never have to worry about writing down every other package you have used in this application. If you're in Python, it's a real thing. But with pipenv, you actually don't have to worry about that. Pipenv does quite well at managing it's aware of your environment, and it's aware of your package management and package dependencies, and it's quite great. So pipenv just has this pip file, which most important thing there is saying which Python version this project uses, and it's able to pick that up. If you're creating if you're moving to pip from an old project, it just assumes the Python version to be whatever Python was running during the time. And this is also really nice because it sets it for you, which is quite amazing, because trying to figure out which version of Python you're using on your virtual env can be a problem. Although now that Python 2 is getting deprecated, I don't know if that will continue to be a problem. And that's just your main pip file, and it kind of declares a lot of stuff. And then there's your pip log file. So your pip log file is where all your dependencies, all the way down to the hash, and all the metadata for a package that you've installed is stored. So every time you pipenv install something, it writes a hash for it, and it also does this really cool thing where it gets all the metadata for the exact code that you've installed as a dependency, and this helps you build deterministic builds. So sometimes a package has the same version name, but then those version names are different. Like, I don't know how many releases, but sometimes you make a release and then you realize, oh, I forgot something, but I can't have a different release name or a version name because then I have to explain that, like, I forgot to add this one little thing. So I'm gonna make this next version release, but name it the same thing. And that can be a problem if you're trying to build things deterministically, and then you find that your Travis CI fails for something that's completely unrelated. So piplock does a really good job of like writing the exact hash of the package dependency installation you wrote. And it also has this cool thing, which is a pipenv graph. So if you're installing stuff on pip, you may actually not know what other dependencies are being installed. So let's say you install pytest, and you realize, nah, I don't need pytest. Pytest has installed a whole bunch of things that you may not be aware of. And what that means is that your environment is now in a messy state, and you find that things don't work, and then you realize that this is caused by another dependency. And then you're like, but I don't remember installing this. And it's just a result of like just continuously changing environments. But pipenv will always be aware of what was installed by what. And you can see from this graph that pygrep, pytest, Django has all these other installations, and all those packages, package dependencies, have all these version requirements, and it can manage that quite well. And so if you uninstall one package, it will automatically uninstall everything that comes with it. And this makes sure that across the different working environments, if there's different people working on the project, they'll all have the same virtual environment at all times. And to install pipenv, it's just pip install pipenv. So awkward thing there is you need pip for pipenv. And can't replace something you don't need, I guess. And pipenv log just logs all your dependencies and makes sure that everything's updated. And in the event that there's something that's lingering around, it will just clean up your virtual environment. And if you're moving from pip to pipenv, you can just install all your requirements from your pipenv file. So you get from your pip requirements file. Sorry. So you just go pipenv install requirements, and it installs everything in your requirements file into your pipenv. So you don't actually have to start installing on your packages manually. Yeah. So when I started the first part of Buza, when me and my friends started it, we all just kind of were, right, like doing really awful coding, and we were just all trying to deploy stuff and get stuff working as soon as possible. And we were all really proud of just getting stuff to work. And we never thought about anyone else reading our code. When I then started working on my own, I never thought about anyone reading my code. However, when you're working on an open source project, other people reading your code is as important as you being able to read the code, because no one wants to contribute to a project that's all over the place. Because if you have installs that don't seem to be used, it becomes a huge problem for someone else who's trying to figure out what's going on. Then contributing to your project just becomes a whole mess. So it's important to think about your coding style. It's important to think about how other people will be able to read your code. But also, we write, so a good way to do this is through static tests. Static tests don't check if your code works or if it's nice, if it runs properly. It just makes sure that your code base is readable, maintainable, and reusable, and up to industry standards. And basically, static tests really do make it production code. The first way to just get really started with static tests is just doing code reviews and asking someone else to look at your code and not pushing code that only you have seen, because there are times when you literally overlook a rogue print statement, or your variable names actually don't make sense. Maybe you created the variable when you had one implementation, you change it, but later on your variable name's still the same, and 2 weeks down the line that variable name does not make sense, and then it kind of leaves the question of what was this actually doing. And with your code reviews, you want to keep them as small as possible. When I was a junior developer, I used to think I could, I'm still a junior developer, but when I was junior, I used to think I could trick all the seniors by writing really long pull requests and hoping that they would be so overwhelmed they would approve my pull requests. They're not that dumb. They're way smarter than that. So when you have long pull requests, people actually don't overlook it. They skim for errors. They skim for anything that's wrong. And instead of actually looking at your code, they just tell you what's wrong. And that can be very discouraging, because it takes a bit of a while for someone to make time from their schedule to look at your pull request. And if your pull request is 20 files, they're not going to go through it. They're just going to tell you that's wrong. And that's all you're going to be doing all day. So the smaller your pull requests are, it makes it a lot easier for people to kind of give you meaningful and constructive feedback. And it also means that you get to ship stuff quickly and you look really busy, like you know what you're doing. And then there is Flake 8. So Flake 8 is like, I think of Flake 8 as your restaurant inspector. Flake 8 does not care if your restaurant food is nice, if your presentation is nice, or if people actually enjoy being at the restaurant. Flake 8 wants to know if your conditions are clean. Is your restaurant clean? Are there any rats lying around? Are there any variables that seem to be used, but they're not declared anywhere, or you've declared variables, but you haven't really used them? Do you have unused imports? Are your lines too long? So Flake 8 does a really good job of like helping you keep your code base very neat and easy to use, and that can make a huge difference when you're onboarding someone, because with Buza being an open source project, people tend to jump on and off depending on their schedules. The easier it is to onboard someone, the easier it is for them to start getting working. Because what me and Pi often struggled with in the beginning is that it took so long to get someone used to the code base that we weren't doing anything for a long time. We were just getting people used to stuff. And yeah, so to get started with Flake 8, you just install it. And remember to exclude all your virtual environments. If you take this off and you run, if you remove that exclude virtual environments and you run your Flake 8 and you run it against your favorite packages and you see how other people are writing really messy code and you feel better about yourself. And then there's MyPy. So I got introduced to MyPy like a few months ago and I didn't know about this, and it's the idea of statically typed Python where you actually declare what types you're expecting. So what happens in Python is that Python does a really good job of trying to help you figure out what you were doing. However, there's times when things need to fail so that you can know you're doing the wrong thing and then fix it. If you pass a string into a method that expects an array, it splits that string up by using an empty space. And then what you'll find is when I was doing a translation method that expected an array of words and then it would translate it, but I was only passing in one word. And then it would just try to translate every letter in that word, and I was not getting translations. And you sit there thinking, Python translations don't even really work. And then I went into the shell, and I started printing the output, and I just saw the word just showing up vertically, and I was like, that's not supposed to happen, is it? So statically writing, so like just statically declaring that I actually expect this to be of this type can also save you a lot of heartache. Yay. And then there's isort. Isort is a cherry on top to your static test. It makes you look like you really have your stuff together. So it just sorts out your imports for you, and it puts all the imports from Python at the top. So for instance, your UUID and your pretty print will be at the top, and then it makes a space, and then it pulls all your maybe Django imports and stuff, and that makes it look like you put a lot of effort to make this look good, but it just does it for you. So isort is pretty awesome. And you can also, when it runs, it automatically does everything for you. It automatically imports stuff for you. But if you don't want it to import, you can run it isort on a particular file and say --diff just to see the difference, what the difference will be, just in case. Yeah. So when you start your environment, you've got an environment, you've already set up all your static tests, and you kind of have a strong idea of what you're going to do, and things can now get very exciting. What you actually want to look out for is test-driven development. So in the first version of Buza, I had one test, and that test worked, and I was like, TDD, here we go. And then I wrote the next test, and the next test didn't work, and I was like, you know what, never mind, it's okay. I'm gonna just leave all the tests behind, and then that was like the it for me with testing that project. But when I started working with Pi, and she was like, if your test is not coded, there's no way of telling what works and what doesn't work, and so you actually need to write tests, and I had to kind of get myself into writing tests. And a cool way for me to think about writing tests is you write the test, and then you reward yourself with the code. Yes. So, writing tests for models, I always just write the model, run the migrations, and then you write the tests that kind of check that the actual model works properly and it returns whatever you want it to return when you create an instance. But if you're testing for views, this is where it gets really fun. You just start with your tests, and your test will just make a request to your URL name, and then check that the HTTP response is okay, and that all the templates are used to render your view. So if you go to your browser and you go to, let's say for instance, localhost 8000/home, are all the right templates used? Is the HTTP response okay? And also, do you have a context that's of the question list? In this case, it was the list view for all the questions. And then once you have your test set up, the first thing that will fail, it will fail because you actually haven't declared that view and that view name. Not that view, the URL name, sorry. So then you can try to create the view, and this view are like class-based views, and you just create the view and you tell it which model that is, and that will just make sure that it passes the right context. And then you create the URL name, and you've already passed it there. So the nice thing about having written tests is that as you write the test, you think of the really good URL name, because most of the times when you're thinking of writing the URL name just so you can go and use it, you often name it very weirdly or very inappropriately because you're in a rush to go and use it. But if you name it while you're writing tests, you're a bit more clear in how you actually want this to be and how you want it to work. And once you've named that, then you can add your HTML file. So this is how it works in Django. You just write this. This is the HTML file that would load the questions list. And you can actually see there's literally no JavaScript here, but you would get a simple heading with all the questions in it and all the questions being able to render. You can add some CSS there just to make it prettier, but you still wouldn't actually really need any JavaScript. Unless, of course, you want to add it later on. That's up to you. Yeah. And then now when you run your test, you've actually got your question list URL, you've got your HTTP response, hopefully that works, and you've made sure that you've named your templates based on what you wanted your test to be, so all your tests should work. And you can then add more tests, so after all the basics works, and after you make everything prettier, you go back to your test, and then you start updating your test and doing everything properly. And also testing for authentication. Django has a really good authentication system, and you don't often have to worry about the wrong user being able to edit your post, but it's still a good idea just to ensure that at no point will the wrong person ever be able to kind of do things that only another user should do. So I over-test for that, just for good measure. Yeah, and test coverage. So you have written all your tests, and you did test first development. Sometimes you may still not know how good your tests are, how much of your tests run through your code base, and how much of it is missed, and maybe where you've over-tested. Sometimes you have things that you know are easier to test, so you overcompensate those tests, and then you don't write tests for other things. So adding test coverage for your application can help you find out where your tests are missing, because where your test coverage doesn't find it, your users probably will, so it's a good idea to find it before they do. So initially I didn't even have code coverage, but at the end the application started looking like this, and like everything, there's still like that little red part, but we can overlook that. But the test coverage then eventually started looking like this, and I started feeling really pretty. And I was at a talk at ScaleConf, and one of the speakers made a very valid point about how we as developers view code coverage. And the question she asked is, who do you write tests for? Are you writing tests for yourself or your users? And if so, what does that number mean to your users? What does having a lot of tests mean for your users? You need to think about that as opposed to, I feel really good that my test is covered. So that's like a very good point that I was thinking about the other day. Yes, and continuous integration. So now that everything sort of kind of works and I've got all these tests set up, the next thing we had to do was set it up on Travis so that it could rebuild like deterministically and tell us what your new code base can do, what your new code, how it'll affect your code base. And then once we've deployed a feature, once we've got a feature working and we've pushed it to develop or master, we then push it to the Docker Hub. We push it to Docker Hub and it creates a new Docker image. And that's our current continuous integration pipeline. Yeah, so our Travis file, this is a random Travis file that I got from another open source project that I work on. You can see because they still use pip and not pipenv. And this is what our Travis file, this is what the Travis file looks like. You just tell it that this is using Python, cache pip, and then it does all the installing all your stuff, installing the requirements, and then it runs your Flake 8. It runs your Flake 8 tests, and then only when your Flake 8 passes does it then run your template lint if you want to add template lint tests, and then PyTest. And then it checks that if your code was built in a different environment and everything was started from scratch, would your test still work? Would everything be working exactly as is? And this prevents you from things like, well, it worked on my machine, I don't know about you. And this also helps because every time someone makes a contribution to the code base, there might not be in any other way for me to tell if this person's code may actually be ruining other things, because it would really suck to have to run everyone's branch for myself. It would kind of make me look a bit like a dictator, so I'm glad Travis can do that for me. And yeah. Yes, takeoff. So when we had to first deploy the application, it was my first time doing a proper deploy. Previously, whenever I worked on a project, I would just deploy on Heroku. You get a free Arduino when you get a free deploy, especially when you're on the student account. They give you like a proper one, which is really awesome. So I wanted to deploy Buza on Heroku the first time because it's really easy to set up, and I had done it before. However, it was incredibly slow. Like, I could not figure out why everything was so slow on Heroku. And yeah, this is just like showing you how to deploy stuff on Heroku. It's really nice. You just say, hey, this is using GitHub. You connect it to GitHub. It gets your source code, and it does all the magic for you. And then, like, your site is like really slow. And Heroku also gets really expensive as you get more users. And then I decided to just kind of move over to DigitalOcean. But then I had to like do proper containerization. Then we started using Docker containers. And I think I once sat through a 30-minute SRE call with Jeremy, and he gave a very good explanation of how Docker works, and in the end I was like, cool story. I still don't get it, but cool story. So with Docker containers, some time ago, whenever you wanted to deploy an application, you had to create a virtual machine, and then you would then run your application on that virtual machine, and then you would spawn up the different virtual machines to run different versions, the different applications so that you can manage traffic. However, it's overkill to have an entire OS just to run your one application. So what you'd actually want to do is to abstract away your actual thingy, abstract away the actual operating system, and run your containers, which are basically just like isolated processes that can run completely unaware of the next process. And then that makes it a lot easier. And your Docker container only actually has your application and its dependencies instead of having an entire OS that has a whole bunch of other things. And that makes them lighter and cheaper to run. And yeah, and this is our Docker file. And it just looks like this. You actually just rewrite your application. It looks a lot like your Travis file because it just has that everything. And if you actually look at this part, so we installed Yarn because we're using some Bootstrap stuff, and then we're using Yarn to kind of cache those. And if you actually look at it, it just installs pipenv, and then it goes into CP, and then it runs the environment variables, because pipenv, we're using environment variables instead of running with the manage.py, instead of running your manage.py file. And then we install everything system deploy, so it kind of just then installs everything that's especially not in your dev installations, and then it runs the migrations and exposes port 8000. So that's really cool. And getting this together was quite difficult, but what I found really helped was the ZA Slack tag. They have a Docker channel, and I think in the beginning, I was there every day like, I don't know, it says this, I can't read, I don't know what this means. And everyone there was like really lovely, and they kind of helped me get through it. And yeah, that's the end of it. So actually, this is an awkward ending. So currently, the application where it is now is we're still doing basic user testing with some students at a school. I haven't made it public yet because I don't want to have to deal with like everyone coming in at once, if anyone comes. So we're still doing simple testing with the students and trying to figure out how we can kind of get it to be better for them and to be able to use it. And also because it's not yet on Facebook Free Basics, it's still costing the school internet for them to be able to use it. And that's where the application is at the moment. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes.
How do you get something onto Facebook Free Basics?
Oh, okay, cool. You create a there's freebasics.facebook.com, and then you kind of register, and then you write a letter motivating why your application is really amazing, it's going to make a change in the world. And then it goes through a 3 weeks process for them to kind of decide what's good enough for Free Basics, and then they just put it up. Yeah.
That's awesome. How long did it take?
We're still in the process, yeah. Because I think at the moment they're moving to Free Basics 2, so everything is still everything. So when you apply now, Free Basics 2 isn't out yet, but the team it's the same team that's going to Free Basics 2. So everything on Free Basics 1 is still like very much like worse. Yeah, everything is still at the back, so it's taking forever to get stuff in.
Any other
Yes.
questions? Yes.
Yeah.
How many users does your website have?
So yeah, the website isn't public, like you can't go to it. We do only use it with the students at the school, and we have about 10 students that we're actually just running it with. And that's just me going there once a week and going, hey, let me teach you how to code. By the way, did you know that I have an application? I feel like a SoundCloud rapper just randomly going, use my app. Yeah. Yes.
Which database backend did you use?
We're just using Postgres. But yeah, it's like a cliche. Yeah. Yeah.
And in terms of contribution to the code base,
Yes.
how many devs do you have?
We have quite a lot of. Actually, let me check.
See the repo.
Yes, let's see the.
You get a good read. Those are hard, so
Yeah.
I'm asking because of that.
5. I think we have 5. I don't know. Yeah, there's me and Pi, and yeah, that's about 5 people. I don't know what's community. Oh, okay. No, I don't know what that was. I feel like I see new stuff on GitHub all the time.
It's super cool.
Yeah.
It's new.
Yeah, there's new stuff all the time. The other day, I saw a little star next to my GitHub account, and I was like, what does this mean? Am I verified? Then I found out it's just because I'm on the pro account. I was like, okay. I felt important for like 2 seconds. Any other questions? Yes.
Are you planning to test the performance of the application? This is like for now, it's like
Of users, yeah.
because it's gonna expand like if you have to like onboard many schools and all that.
Yeah.
Are you planning to tackle that?
A friend of mine actually does that kind of stuff, and he was like, yeah, I'll do that. And he's also the one integrating React.js into it and trying to figure out what the speed difference is and how we can improve that kind of stuff. Yeah, so, yeah. Sometimes, like, there's a whole bunch of other stuff where I'm like, you know this, don't you? You do this at work. Help me out. Yeah.
That's great. It's
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. Yes.
How do you, so I often look at you see junior developers, and what you're telling me is not what I know junior developers know. How like it looks like just starting this, you learned everything that you needed to know to become an intermediate developer.
Right.
I want to
Yeah.
just force my juniors for 3 weeks and be like, try a side project. And then,
Go sit with her and you don't her anymore.
I don't know how to answer that, I guess. But in the beginning, it was very frustrating when I started working with Pi because we did a lot of peer programming, and she does like Vim stuff.
Yeah.
She like codes in like Vim, and I'm like, oh my word, I only know how to save files. I only use Vim to like make a release, and I do the change, like the file change, and then I'm like exit quickly before anything goes wrong. And I used to feel a bit like I felt very strongly like I wasn't learning because I was watching her, and there was times when I was like, I'm gonna cry because she's not letting me do anything. And then when I started doing stuff by myself, it felt like I had been doing it with her. Like it felt like very intuitive. So I think you have to go through that really painful process of trusting the process and not always wanting to be right about everything. I think because you come from a university where you've spent 4 years doing this and you were in your honors year where compared to all the first year and second years, you were one of the smartest, and then you get to work and you kind of have to start from the bottom and you have to swallow your pride and just literally be a junior. And I had to learn that that's okay. It's okay to kind of trust everyone else. Yes.
Where do you currently work?
I work at Preycult. Yeah.
Where are you guys based?
It's remote work. yeah, you have an office in Joburg, we have an office in Cape Town, and there's person working in Nigeria, there's another person in London, there's another person in Netherlands, I think, and yeah, we get new people all the time. I think someone moved to Bali recently. It's just so now when we want to do business in Bali, everyone's like, yeah, we've got an office in Bali. Yeah, Eric's house is definitely our office in Bali.
Put it on the website. Eric's.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So, what were you thinking in terms of language support?
Yes. So at the moment, So the problem with, especially we're primarily targeting students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and there isn't much translation support for languages. So we actually are trying to think, should we create a separate way of being able to find translations, or should we actually ask people to do translations and pay people? So for instance, we can have people who manage translations and be like, hey, if you see a question, just translate it. And then what can happen is, if you're a user and you see a question and you're quite interested maybe in the topic, and you can pick up the keywords, but you don't really know what the question is saying, and then you can just translate it. You can just click on the translation and you'll view someone else's translation, or request for a question to be translated, and then you can then add your answer, but then stipulate that this is in English. The user may not be able to understand it. Can you please translate it? And then, yeah. So that will be it will be quite expensive, but it will be the easiest way to get translations, as opposed to actually doing a natural language processor for probably 9 languages with no starting code base, especially when you're trying to translate stuff from students that probably don't speak an actual language. Because half of it will be the sentence will start in English. Somewhere it will become Zulu, and then eventually you finish in Sotho, and you're like, yeah, I asked the question though. Yeah.
I asked this because I have some models we've trained, and I will try them, and if they're good, you can have them.
Ah, awesome.
Like Python GitHub
Repo.
project, which we're trying to turn into something.
Okay, cool. Oh, awesome.
Yes.
Yay.
It's Zulu's still hard. So.
Yeah. Yes.
So in terms of the product roadmap,
Yeah.
is there integration with social platforms in the pipeline? Because you did mention that some of these kids that
Yeah.
are into
Social. Yeah, so we are, for instance, our auth system is actually, we're using Facebook and Google and Twitter, because most students were concerned that people who were actually looking at probably won't have email accounts, and creating an email account just to use the application is a problem. But if we go for SMS authentication, that's money. We don't have money. And so we're just going to say, hey, you most probably already have a Facebook account. You most probably already have a Twitter account. Can you just use that to log in? Or you could create a Facebook account using your number, and Facebook will send you an SMS for verification, and then you can please come back to our site. Yeah. Yes.
How do you incentivize kids to actually answer questions?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we incentivize? So we realized that a lot of, we are actually going to work with Shoko in university students. And so we did a survey, and we found that a lot of first year and second year university students do want to volunteer, but the problem is just the timing, and just also what we found interesting is the emotional attachment. People leave tutoring, it's volunteering projects, just because you get so attached to the kids and you realize you can't really help them, and you're like, I was just here to help you with math, now I know your life problems, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist. And so we thought maybe we could reach out to Shoko and say, hey, all the people who've kind of dropped out of your project for particular reasons like this, would they be interested in then helping the high school students? So we're not directly aiming at students helping each other, we're hoping to have university students who want to do volunteer work, and maybe if we can get it registered as actual volunteer work that you might get credit for. Yeah. Yes.
So let's say one of the students asks a mathematics question.
Yeah.
How do you get around, the formulas?
The formulas, yeah. That's one thing we're trying to figure out. We're trying to see if we should add like maybe a separate page for formulas where you can click on the formulas and add them into it. But then that might not work well for students with feature phones because you may not be, like that view might not be the same. So we're actually trying now to figure out how we're going to get around that. And that would be a really good reason to then add images and be like just to write, just to write what you want to write and then whatnot. Yeah.